But moving on now to perhaps the biggest story of the day, and this ties into the COVID hysteria, because in their own justification for it, they say, we've got all these people to mass comply to ridiculous, hysterical COVID mandates, mainly via government tracking apps via their cell phones. And this is what we're going to do with carbon credit allowances in the name of stopping another hysterical non-entity, man-made global warming. Headline out of Summit.News, technocrats want mandatory carbon credit cards, that's their word, not mine, to control every facet of your life. Technocrats are preparing mandatory personal carbon allowances that would introduce rationing into every area of your life via an app that would record your travel, heating expenses, and even the food you eat. If you eat too much red meat, if you eat too many hamburgers, if you don't eat enough bugs and worms that are UN approved, then you're going to go over your carbon credit limit, because of course those foodstuffs impact on the planet, and you're going to have to buy extra carbon allowances that allow you basic life privileges. This is the agenda that they're setting up, and they're bragging about it. They're very proud about it. The proposal was presented in the science journal Nature by 4 environmental experts as a means of reducing global carbon emissions. Everyone would be issued with a carbon allowance card that would, this is a quote, entail all adults receiving an equal tradable carbon allowance that reduces over time in line with national carbon targets. So again, it starts off pretty low and it gets less and less and less as this ridiculous zero carbon agenda comes into full play. The authors make it clear the program would be a national mandatory policy. Again, that's another quote. And that carbon units would be, quote, deducted from the personal budget with every payment of transport fuel, home heating fuels and electricity bills, and anyone going over the limit would be forced to purchase additional units in the personal carbon market from those with excess to sell. This will only impact the middle class and the poor because, as we know, the private jet flying ultra-rich elite that literally buy islands on Fiji, which you're not allowed to travel to under COVID lockdown rules, they'll simply just buy more credits from the very infrastructure, from the very system that they're invested in, that they own. You don't own it, but you'll be forced to buy extra carbon credits if you have one fillet steak too many in a month. You know, people who lived in communist China talk about the fact that as late as the late 80s, red meat, steak, beef was seen as a delicacy that maybe they could have a few times a year on special occasions, birthdays, etc. That's the agenda they want for you and your family in the name of saving the planet. Meanwhile, they'll continue to fly private jet to their ultra-rich exclusive islands in Fiji and different areas of the world where they've built their luxury underground bunkers. But of course, you'll be forced to pay into the system that you don't even own. You'll be forced to pay increasingly accelerating rents, inflation driving home prices to completely unaffordable levels. You'll own nothing, and as the World Economic Forum says, you'll be happy. The proposal makes clear that the means of measuring a person's uptake of carbon units for travel would function, quote, on the basis of the tracking of the user's movement history. So this will be a mandatory government app that tracks the miles traveled in your vehicle and charges you based on the carbon emissions. If you travel too far in a month, or if you've eaten too much red meat, then that will top out your carbon limit. You will be overdrawn to Mother Nature, and you'll have to pay these Rothschilds-owned carbon entities, investment structures, more money simply to live a basic lifestyle. Goes on to say the authors note how the normalization of contact tracing via COVID-19 apps will ensure a similar system can be used for keeping track of carbon credits with minimum fuss. Quote, recent studies show how COVID-19 contact tracing apps were successfully implemented with mandatory schemes in several East Asian countries, such as China. This is the social credit score for the West. But again, as we've said before, it's even worse. Because at least China, as I made clear in the last video, they don't punish people for engaging in private personal beliefs which are related to protecting the family. If you go against the grain in terms of even the narrative of calling out some of these destructive critical race theory movements, establishment-controlled LGBT movements, hormone injections for trans kids movements, then that will be deducted from your social credit score too. Not doing that in China, but that will be part of the social credit score in the West. It's going to be even worse. So as the authors specifically note how mass unquestioning compliance with COVID lockdown regulations has greased the skids for further intrusive tyranny, and that, quote, people may be more prepared to accept the tracking and limitations related to PCAs, personal carbon allowances, to achieve a safer climate. As we mentioned before, this is obedience dog training, and now everyone's used to it. Everyone's used to the ridiculous farce of having to take off your face mask when you walk 10 yards to your dinner table. This is what we've been trained, this is what we've been inoculated to perform on a repeated basis as a form of conformist obedience. The increasing sophistication of artificial intelligence technologies would also, quote, make it possible to easily track and manage people's food and consumption related emissions. So this isn't just going to be taxed by mile, Big Brother tracking every mile you drive, where you go, and then charging you the carbon expenses off of the back of it. This is going to be so micromanaged that it's going to be down to the food you eat, which we already have under the Chinese social credit score. Of course, they punish people for eating junk food. They punish people for their purchases, which include things like video games. So this is going to be down to the level of punishing you not only for your political opinions, not only for the fact that you didn't take the 8th booster of the COVID vaccine, but for the fact that you had a fillet steak maybe a couple of times a month. This is the technocracy that we're all going under. In other words, eating what Big Brother deems to be an excess of red meat or anything else deemed harmful to the planet will result in a carbon credit reduction. But again, if you stick to the UN recommended mealworms and bugs and, dried crickets, then you'll probably be okay. What a July 4th celebration that'll be. Wesley Smith, writing for, I think it was the Epoch Times, says we still have the power to thwart rule by experts through democratic means. That's up for debate. But if we lack the courage, if we acquiesce against significant liberty constraints in the name of protecting health, the soft totalitarianism we will have facilitated will not be their fault, it will be ours. And as we've seen in Australia again, you travel more than 5 kilometers outside of where you live, then you get punished. You talk to your neighbor, you get punished. As we previously highlighted, the idea of climate lockdowns is also being normalized in light of the mass compliance to pandemic lockdowns. Remember the World Economic Forum, oh, the cities are so quiet. Nature is returning because everyone's locked inside their houses, eating mealworms and dried crickets. That's the agenda that they want, and they're openly announcing it in nature establishment journals. Moon Battery reports media begs public for unvaxxed COVID deaths. This is WXYZ TV channel put out a Facebook post saying, after the vaccines were available to everyone, did you lose an unvaccinated loved one to COVID? If you're willing to share your family story, please DM us your contact information. So they're openly canvassing for these kind of stories. What's funny about this is if you look at the comments, they're predominantly people, as they point out in this article, victims who have been vaxxed, and some are vaccine victims themselves. So this spectacularly backfired, but now they're so desperate for these cases that they're openly canvassing for them on social media. Another headline, poll finds vaccinated Americans significantly more likely to dump their friends over stance on COVID-19 jab. No surprise there. The people who virtue signal all day about how loving, compassionate and caring they are far more likely to sever relationships and atomize friends and families if they hold a different opinion.